The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse as Judge Robert Williams adjusted his black robe and prepared for what he thought would be another routine day. At 52 years old, he had been serving on the bench for over 15 years, earning respect from lawyers and colleagues alike for his fair judgments and calm demeanor. What he didn't know was that this Tuesday morning would change everything. The courtroom was packed with people waiting for the custody hearing to begin. In the front row sat a young mother named Lisa, nervously clutching a folder of documents. She had been fighting for custody of her 8-year-old daughter for months, claiming her ex-husband had been violent and unstable. Her ex-husband, Tony, sat on the opposite side with his lawyer, looking confident and relaxed. Judge Williams called the court to order and reviewed the case file one more time. This was a complicated situation involving allegations of domestic violence, and he knew he needed to be extra careful with his decisions. The welfare of a child was at stake, and he took that responsibility seriously. "Good morning, everyone," Judge Williams said in his calm, authoritative voice. "We're here today to determine custody arrangements for the minor child in the case of Henderson versus Henderson. I want to remind everyone that this court is focused solely on what's best for the child involved." The mother's lawyer stood up first, presenting evidence of the father's anger issues and past incidents. They had photos of bruises, medical records, and witness statements from neighbors who had heard shouting and arguing coming from the house. It painted a disturbing picture of a man who couldn't control his temper. Then it was time for the father's side to present their case. His lawyer called several witnesses, including friends who testified about what a good father Tony was. But the most important witness was supposed to be Officer Rick Coleman, a police officer who had responded to one of the domestic violence calls months earlier. Officer Coleman walked into the courtroom wearing his crisp uniform, his badge shining under the fluorescent lights. He was a big man with broad shoulders and a stern face that rarely showed emotion. At 45 years old, he had been with the police force for 20 years and had developed a reputation for being tough on criminals. What most people in the courtroom didn't know was that Officer Coleman had a file full of complaints at the police station. Citizens had accused him of using excessive force, making inappropriate comments, and treating certain communities unfairly. His supervisors had talked to him about these issues several times, but somehow he always managed to avoid serious consequences. As Officer Coleman took the witness stand, Judge Williams noticed something in the officer's eyes that made him uncomfortable. There was a hardness there, almost like anger waiting to surface. But the judge pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. "Officer Coleman," the father's lawyer began, "you responded to a domestic violence call at the Henderson residence on March 15th of this year. Can you tell us what you found when you arrived?" Coleman straightened up in his chair and spoke in a flat, professional voice. "When I arrived at the scene, I found no evidence of any physical altercation. The complainant, Mrs. Henderson, appeared calm and showed no visible injuries. Mr. Henderson was cooperative and answered all my questions honestly." Judge Williams frowned as he looked at the police report in front of him. Something didn't add up. The medical record showed that Lisa had been treated at the emergency room just 2 days after this incident for bruises on her arms and face. How could Officer Coleman have missed signs of violence? "Officer Coleman," Judge Williams interrupted, "according to the medical records I have here, Mrs. Henderson was treated for injuries consistent with physical assault just 48 hours after your visit. Did you document any signs of distress or injury during your investigation?" Coleman's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "No, Your Honor. I conducted a thorough investigation and found no evidence to support the allegations." The judge studied the police report more carefully. It was unusually brief for such a serious call. Most domestic violence reports he had seen were detailed and thorough, but this one seemed rushed and incomplete. There were no photos taken, no statements from neighbors, and no follow-up investigation mentioned. "Officer Coleman, I notice your report is quite brief. Standard procedure for domestic violence calls typically includes photographs of the scene, interviews with neighbors, and detailed statements from both parties. Can you explain why these elements are missing from your report?" For the first time, Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I followed all proper procedures. Your Honor, sometimes these situations are straightforward and don't require extensive documentation, Judge." Williams had been doing this job long enough to know when someone wasn't telling the whole truth. He had seen countless police officers testify, and the good ones were always thorough and detailed in their reports. Something about Coleman's testimony didn't feel right. The mother's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, we have statements from 3 neighbors who heard screaming and sounds of a struggle that night. They're prepared to testify that they called the police because they were concerned for Mrs. Henderson's safety." Judge Williams looked back at Officer Coleman. "Officer, did you interview any neighbors during your investigation?" Coleman's face was starting to show signs of irritation. "I spoke to the parties involved, which is standard procedure. Neighbors often exaggerate what they think they hear." "That's not what I asked, Officer Coleman. Did you or did you not interview the neighbors who made the original complaint?" The courtroom was getting tense. Everyone could feel the friction building between the judge and the police officer. Lisa sat forward in her seat, hoping that finally someone would listen to her story and believe what had really happened that night. "I determined that interviewing neighbors was unnecessary based on my initial assessment of the situation," Coleman said, his voice getting slightly louder. Judge Williams set down the police report and looked directly at the officer. "Officer Coleman, it's not your job to determine what's necessary when it comes to investigating potential domestic violence. It's your job to follow department procedures and thoroughly investigate all complaints. Did your department train you on proper domestic violence investigation protocols?" Coleman's face was getting red now. He wasn't used to being questioned so directly, especially by someone he felt should be showing him more respect. In his mind, police officers were the ones who dealt with real criminals on the streets, while judges sat in comfortable courtrooms making decisions without understanding what it was really like out there. "Yes, I've been trained," Coleman said through gritted teeth. "Then you understand that incomplete investigations can put victims at risk and undermine the justice system," Judge Williams continued. "A child's safety depends on this court having accurate and complete information." The tension in the room was building with each exchange. The lawyers on both sides were watching carefully, knowing that Officer Coleman's credibility was crucial to their cases. If the judge didn't believe his testimony, it could change everything. Coleman gripped the arms of the witness chair tighter. He had never liked being questioned or having his authority challenged, but there was something about this particular judge that was really getting under his skin. The way Judge Williams spoke so calmly and confidently, the way everyone in the courtroom seemed to respect his authority, it all made Coleman feel small and insignificant. "Your Honor," Coleman said, his voice now carrying an edge of anger, "I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know how to investigate domestic violence calls, and I know the difference between real violence and people making up stories." Judge Williams remained calm but firm. "Officer Coleman, the evidence suggests otherwise. We have medical records, witness statements, and photographs that contradict your conclusion. I'm going to need you to explain this discrepancy." The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone could sense that something was about to happen, but no one could have predicted what would come next. Officer Coleman was struggling to control his anger, and Judge Williams was simply doing his job, trying to get to the truth so he could make the best decision for a child's future. As the morning wore on, it became clear that this was more than just a custody hearing. It was a clash between 2 very different views of justice and authority, and the tension was about to reach a breaking point that would shock everyone in that courtroom. Judge Williams could see that Officer Coleman was getting more agitated with each question, but he had a job to do. The safety of an 8-year-old girl depended on getting to the truth, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even a police officer, stand in the way of justice. "Officer Coleman, I'm going to ask you one more time," Judge Williams said, his voice still calm but more serious now. "Did you take any photographs at the scene that night?" Coleman's hands were clenched into fists now, though he tried to keep them hidden under the witness stand. "No, I did not take photographs because there was nothing to photograph." The mother's lawyer stood up again. "Your Honor, we have photos taken by Mrs. Henderson herself the morning after the incident showing clear bruising and swelling. We also have the emergency room records confirming these injuries." Judge Williams nodded and looked at the photos that were handed to him. Even from across the courtroom, people could see his expression change as he studied the images. The bruises were dark and clearly visible, the kind that would take days to develop and weeks to heal. "Officer Coleman," the judge said, holding up one of the photos, "how do you explain these injuries if there was no physical altercation?" Coleman glanced at the photo and his face twisted into a sneer. "People get bruises all the time. Could have been from anything. Women like her, they know how to make things look worse than they are. A gasp went through the courtroom. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the father's lawyer looked surprised by Coleman's comment. Judge Williams set the photo down slowly, his face showing the first signs of real anger. Officer Coleman, that comment is completely inappropriate and unprofessional. I'm going to ask you to stick to the facts and keep your personal opinions to yourself. But Coleman was past the point of controlling himself. The frustration and anger that had been building up for months, maybe years, was starting to pour out. He had been questioned and criticized by supervisors, complained about by citizens, and now here was this judge treating him like he didn't know how to do his job. I'm just telling the truth. Your Honor, Coleman said, putting extra emphasis on the title in a way that sounded almost mocking. I've seen plenty of these cases where people make up stories to get what they want. The courtroom was getting more uncomfortable by the minute. The court reporter was typing furiously, making sure to capture every word. The bailiffs, who usually stood quietly in the background, were starting to pay closer attention to what was happening. Judge Williams took a deep breath. He had dealt with difficult witnesses before, but there was something different about this situation. Officer Coleman wasn't just being uncooperative, he was being openly disrespectful, and there seemed to be something deeper driving his behavior. Officer Coleman, I'm going to call a brief recess so you can collect yourself. When we return, I expect you to answer questions professionally and stick to the facts. Do I make myself clear? Coleman stared at the judge for a long moment, his face getting redder by the second. Crystal clear, he said, but his tone suggested anything but compliance. We'll take a 15-minute recess, Judge Williams announced, hitting his gavel once. Officer Coleman, you're to remain in the witness stand. As the judge stood up to leave the bench, Coleman made no move to get up. This was highly unusual, as witnesses typically step down during recesses unless specifically instructed otherwise. Judge Williams paused and looked back at the officer. Officer Coleman, you may step down during the recess if you'd like. I'm fine right here, Coleman replied, crossing his arms over his chest. There was something defiant in his posture, like a teenager refusing to follow a parent's instructions. Judge Williams felt a chill run down his spine. In 15 years on the bench, he had never had a witness refuse to follow simple courtroom procedures. He decided not to make an issue of it at the moment and left for his chambers, but he made a mental note to keep a close eye on Officer Coleman when court resumed. During the recess, people in the courtroom whispered quietly among themselves. The lawyers huddled with their clients, trying to figure out what was happening and how it might affect their cases. Lisa, the mother fighting for custody, looked worried. She had hoped that having a police officer testify would help her case, but now it seemed like Officer Coleman's behavior might make things worse. The father, Tony, looked confused and frustrated. His lawyer had told him that Officer Coleman's testimony would be crucial to proving that the domestic violence allegations were false. Now his star witness was acting strange and making comments that sounded bad even to him. In his chambers, Judge Williams reviewed the case file again, trying to understand what was driving Officer Coleman's behavior. He had seen police officers get defensive when their work was questioned, but this felt different. There was an anger and resentment that seemed personal, like Coleman had some kind of grudge against the court or against him specifically. When the 15 minutes were up, Judge Williams returned to the courtroom. Officer Coleman was still sitting in the witness stand, his arms crossed and his face set in a scowl. The judge could feel the tension in the room as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Officer Coleman, Judge Williams said as he took his seat, I'm going to ask you some follow-up questions about your investigation. I need you to answer clearly and professionally. Coleman uncrossed his arms but remained slouched in his chair, a posture that showed clear disrespect for the court. I'm ready, he said, though his tone suggested he was anything but cooperative. Did you file any follow-up reports after your initial visit to the Henderson residence? No. Did you recommend that Mrs. Henderson seek medical attention for any injuries? There were no injuries to treat. Did you advise her about resources available to domestic violence victims? She wasn't a victim. Judge Williams was getting frustrated with the short, dismissive answers. Officer Coleman, these are standard procedures in domestic violence investigations. Even if you didn't observe injuries, protocol requires that officers provide information about victim resources. Did you or did you not provide this information? Coleman shifted in his seat and looked directly at the judge with undisguised hostility. I don't need a lecture about police procedures from someone who's never walked a beat or dealt with real criminals. The courtroom went dead silent. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something that should never happen in a courtroom. A police officer had just openly disrespected a judge, questioning his authority and competence in front of a room full of witnesses. Judge Williams felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. Officer Coleman, you are in contempt of court. I'm ordering you to apologize immediately and show proper respect for these proceedings. Coleman let out a harsh laugh. Respect? You want me to respect someone who sits up there in his fancy robe and thinks he knows better than the people who actually do the work? The bailiffs were starting to move closer to the witness stand, sensing that the situation was getting out of control. The court reporter's fingers were flying over her keyboard, documenting every shocking word. Officer Coleman, Judge Williams said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority, you are ordered to step down from the witness stand immediately and compose yourself, or you will be removed from this courtroom. Coleman stood up slowly, but instead of stepping down, he moved closer to the bench. His face was twisted with anger and something else, something darker that made everyone in the room feel uncomfortable. You think you can order me around? Coleman said, his voice getting louder. You think that robe makes you better than me? Judge Williams realized that this situation was spiraling out of control faster than he had ever experienced. He could see the hatred in Coleman's eyes, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuinely threatened in his own courtroom. Bailiffs, he called out, please escort Officer Coleman from the courtroom. But as the bailiffs moved forward, Coleman took another step toward the bench, and Judge Williams knew that something terrible was about to happen. The moment seemed to stretch on forever as Officer Coleman stood there, his face red with rage, staring up at Judge Williams with pure hatred in his eyes. The bailiffs were moving toward him, but they were still several steps away when Coleman's anger finally exploded. You people think you run everything, Coleman shouted. And the way he said you people made everyone in the courtroom understand that this wasn't just about a judge questioning a police officer. This was about something much deeper and more ugly. Judge Williams felt his blood run cold. He had suspected that Coleman's anger was about more than just professional disagreement, but now it was clear that race was playing a role in this confrontation. In all his years on the bench, he had faced subtle prejudice and quiet discrimination, but never anything this open and hostile. Officer Coleman, you need to leave this courtroom immediately, Judge Williams said, trying to maintain his composure even though his heart was racing. He could see the bailiffs getting closer, but Coleman seemed completely out of control now. I don't take orders from someone like you, Coleman screamed, and then he said something that made the entire courtroom gasp in shock. He used a racial slur so vile and hateful that several people in the gallery stood up in outrage. The court reporter's hands actually stopped moving for a moment as she processed what she had just heard. In 20 years of recording court proceedings, she had never encountered anything like this. The lawyers on both sides looked stunned, and even Tony, the father who was supposed to benefit from Coleman's testimony, looked horrified. Judge Williams felt like he had been slapped. The word hung in the air like a poison cloud, filling the courtroom with a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. For a moment, he was transported back to his childhood, remembering all the times he had heard that word used to hurt and diminish people who looked like him. But he was not a child anymore. He was a judge, sworn to uphold justice and maintain order in his courtroom. He had worked too hard and come too far to let anyone, even a police officer, disrespect the court and everything it represented. Officer Coleman, Judge Williams said, his voice now carrying a strength that commanded attention from everyone in the room. You are in criminal contempt of court. Bailiffs, arrest this man immediately. The bailiffs were almost to the witness stand now, but Coleman wasn't finished. Years of resentment and hatred were pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. He had always resented taking orders from people he felt were beneath him. And the fact that this particular judge was black made it even worse in his twisted mind. You don't have the right, Coleman yelled, pointing his finger at Judge Williams. People like you shouldn't be telling people like me what to do. This is America. The irony of his words was lost on Coleman, but not on anyone else in the courtroom. Here was a man sworn to protect and serve all citizens, expressing the kind of hatred that went against everything America was supposed to stand for. Judge Williams stood up behind the bench, his robes flowing around him like the symbol of justice he represented. "Officer Coleman, you are under arrest for contempt of court and disturbing the peace. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." But Coleman was beyond reason now. The bailiffs were just a few feet away when he suddenly lunged forward, reaching across the witness stand toward the judge's bench. Everyone in the courtroom watched in horror as this uniformed police officer, this person who was supposed to represent law and order, completely lost control. "I'll show you who's in charge here," Coleman screamed as he stretched his arm toward Judge Williams. The judge tried to step back, but there wasn't much room behind the bench. Coleman's hand came across the wooden barrier that separated the witness stand from the judge's area, and before anyone could stop him, his palm connected with Judge Williams' face in a loud, sharp slap that echoed through the silent courtroom. The sound seemed to hang in the air forever. Time stopped as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. A police officer had just physically assaulted a sitting judge in open court, in front of dozens of witnesses, with security cameras recording every second. Judge Williams felt the sting of the slap, both physical and emotional. The physical pain was nothing compared to the shock of being attacked in his own courtroom, the place where he was supposed to be safe and in control. For just a moment he felt vulnerable and exposed, the way he had felt as a young black man facing discrimination and hatred. But then his training and his character took over. He touched his cheek where Coleman had hit him, looked directly at the officer who was now being tackled by bailiffs, and did something that would be remembered for years to come. He remained completely calm. While Coleman was screaming and struggling as the bailiffs wrestled him to the ground, Judge Williams simply straightened his robes, took a deep breath, and spoke in a voice that was steady and clear. "Let the record show that Officer Coleman has physically assaulted the court," he said calmly to the court reporter, who was frantically typing to capture every detail of this unprecedented event. The assault was witnessed by approximately 40 people and recorded by courtroom security cameras. The bailiffs had Coleman on the ground now, trying to get handcuffs on him while he continued to shout and struggle. He was yelling more slurs and threats, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the historic courtroom. "You can't do this to me," Coleman screamed from the floor. "I'm a police officer. I have rights." Judge Williams looked down at the man who had just attacked him and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not hatred, but pity. Here was a person so consumed by prejudice and rage that he had thrown away a 20-year career and likely his freedom in a moment of pure hatred. "Officer Coleman," Judge Williams said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "you did have rights, and you threw them away the moment you decided to bring your hatred into my courtroom and assault an officer of the court." The bailiffs finally got Coleman secured and were lifting him to his feet. His uniform was wrinkled and his face was still red with rage, but some of the fight seemed to have gone out of him as he began to realize what he had just done. "This court is now in recess," Judge Williams announced, hitting his gavel with authority. "Officer Coleman, you are charged with assault on a judicial officer, contempt of court, and civil rights violations. You will be held without bail pending arraignment." As the bailiffs dragged Coleman toward the door, he turned back one more time and shouted something so vile and threatening that the bailiffs quickly covered his mouth and rushed him out of the courtroom, Judge. Williams remained standing behind his bench until Coleman was completely out of sight. Only then did he allow himself to sit down, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. The courtroom was still dead silent. No one seemed to know what to do or say after witnessing such an incredible breach of law and order. Lisa, the mother who had started this day hoping for justice in her custody case, was crying quietly in the front row. The lawyers looked stunned, and several people in the gallery were holding their phones, having recorded parts of the incident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Williams said after taking a moment to compose himself, "what you have witnessed today is a reminder that hatred and prejudice have no place in our justice system. This court will not tolerate any form of discrimination or violence, regardless of who perpetrates it." He paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "We will take a longer recess now to allow everyone to process what has happened. When we return, we will continue with the business of this court, because justice cannot be stopped by the actions of one individual who has forgotten his oath and his duty." As Judge Williams left the bench to return to his chambers, he could hear people in the gallery beginning to whisper and talk about what they had just seen. He knew that by the end of the day this incident would be all over the news and social media, But what mattered most to him was that he had maintained his dignity and his commitment to justice, even in the face of the most shocking assault he could have imagined. The real consequences for Officer Coleman were just beginning. Within minutes of Officer Coleman being dragged from the courtroom, the courthouse was buzzing with activity. Word of the assault spread through the building like wildfire, and everyone from security guards to senior judges was talking about what had just happened. In his chambers, Judge Williams sat quietly for a moment, still processing the shock of being physically attacked in his own courtroom. His cheek was slightly red where Coleman had hit him, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional impact of such a blatant act of hatred and disrespect. There was a gentle knock on his door. "Come in," he called, and his clerk, Patricia, entered with a concerned look on her face. "Judge Williams, are you okay?" "Do you need medical attention?" she asked, her voice full of worry. "I'm fine, Patricia," he replied, touching his cheek gently. "It's going to take more than that to rattle me. But I need you to do a few things for me right away." Patricia pulled out her notebook ready to take down instructions. She had worked with Judge Williams for 8 years and had never seen him more focused and determined. "First, I want you to contact the district attorney's office immediately. Tell them I want charges filed against Coleman for assault on a judicial officer, criminal contempt, and civil rights violations. This needs to be treated as a felony assault, not just a misdemeanor." "Yes, sir," Patricia said, writing quickly. "Second, contact courthouse security and make sure they preserve all camera footage from the courtroom. Every angle, every second. That footage is crucial evidence." "Already done, Judge." Security locked down the footage as soon as the incident happened. Judge Williams nodded approvingly. "Good. Third, I want you to contact the State Judicial Council and the FBI. An assault on a judge in open court is a federal matter, especially when it involves civil rights violations." Patricia looked up from her notebook. "The FBI? Are you sure you want to take it that far?" Judge Williams leaned back in his chair and considered the question. He could handle this quietly, let the local authorities deal with Coleman and try to move on. But he knew this was bigger than just one angry police officer. This was about protecting the integrity of the entire justice system. "Patricia, if we don't take this seriously, if we don't send a clear message that this behavior is absolutely unacceptable, then we're telling every racist, every person who thinks they can intimidate the courts, that there are no real consequences for their actions." He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below. "I didn't become a judge to make easy decisions. I became a judge to make sure justice is served even when it's difficult." Meanwhile, down in the courthouse lockup, Officer Coleman was discovering that his troubles were just beginning. The bailiffs had removed his weapon, his badge, and all his personal belongings. He was sitting in a small holding cell, still wearing his wrinkled police uniform, waiting to be processed. The reality of what he had done was starting to sink in. 20 years of police work, a pension, his reputation, his career, all of it was probably gone because of a few minutes of uncontrolled rage. But even now, sitting in a jail cell, he couldn't bring himself to admit that he had been wrong. In his twisted mind, he was the victim here. He was just a hardworking police officer who had been disrespected by a judge who didn't understand what it was like to deal with real criminals. The fact that he had used racial slurs and physically attacked Judge Williams was something he tried to push out of his thoughts. Back in the courtroom, the custody hearing was in chaos. The lawyers for both sides were huddled together, trying to figure out how Coleman's outburst would affect their case. Lisa, the mother fighting for custody, was both horrified by what she had witnessed and relieved that everyone could now see what kind of person had investigated her domestic violence complaint. "This changes everything," her lawyer whispered to her. "Coleman's testimony is completely worthless now. No judge is going to believe anything he said after what just happened." Tony, the father, looked defeated. His star witness had just destroyed any credibility he might have had. His lawyer was already talking about plea deals and settlement agreements. "We need to seriously consider accepting the mother's custody proposal," his lawyer told him quietly. "After what happened today, no judge is going to trust Coleman's investigation or his conclusions." Within an hour, news of the incident had reached the police department where Coleman worked. Chief Thompson was in a meeting when his assistant rushed in with the news. "Chief, we have a problem. Officer Coleman just assaulted a judge in open court. He's been arrested and charged with felony assault. Chief Thompson felt his stomach drop. He had been dealing with complaints about Coleman for years, but he had never imagined it would come to something like this. Get me all of Coleman's personnel files immediately, and I want a press statement prepared. We need to get ahead of this story. The department's Internal Affairs Division was already opening an investigation, but they all knew what the outcome would be. There was no coming back from assaulting a judge in front of dozens of witnesses and security cameras. Back at the courthouse, Judge Williams had returned to the bench to address the people still gathered in the courtroom. Many of them looked shaken by what they had witnessed, and he knew he needed to restore some sense of order and normalcy. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm and reassuring, I want to address what happened here today. What you witnessed was an individual acting out of hatred and prejudice, not a representative of law enforcement or the justice system. He paused and looked around the room, making sure everyone was listening. I have been a judge for 15 years, and I have worked with thousands of police officers who are professional, dedicated, and committed to justice for all people. Officer Coleman's actions today do not represent the vast majority of law enforcement officers who serve our community with honor. Several people in the gallery nodded in agreement. They had been as shocked as anyone by Coleman's behavior. However, Judge Williams continued, we cannot and will not tolerate hatred, discrimination, or violence in our courts. The justice system only works when everyone, regardless of their position or authority, follows the law and treats others with respect. He picked up his gavel and held it for a moment, thinking about the weight of responsibility it represented. Officer Coleman will face the full consequences of his actions. He will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and his case will serve as a reminder that no one is above justice. The court reporter was capturing every word, knowing that this statement would probably be quoted in news reports for days to come. Now, Judge Williams said, we have important business to complete. The custody of a child is at stake, and we will not let one person's hatred prevent us from doing our job. He looked over at the lawyers and the parents involved in the custody case, given the circumstances and the fact that Officer Coleman's testimony has been completely discredited. I am prepared to hear closing arguments and make a decision in this matter. Lisa's lawyer stood up immediately. Your Honor, in light of what we've all witnessed today, and given that Officer Coleman's investigation was clearly biased and incomplete, we request that you grant full custody to our client. Tony's lawyer looked defeated, but he stood up as well. Your Honor, we would like to request a brief recess to discuss a possible settlement with opposing counsel. Judge Williams nodded. Very well. We'll take a 30-minute recess to allow the parties to discuss their options. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Judge Williams remained on the bench for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened. In one morning, he had been assaulted, threatened, and subjected to the worst kind of racial hatred, but he had also seen justice begin to work. Coleman was in jail where he belonged. The biased investigation that had nearly allowed an abusive father to gain custody had been exposed. And most importantly, the dignity and authority of the court had been maintained. His phone was already ringing with calls from reporters, other judges, and community leaders. By evening, the story would be on every news channel in the country. But Judge Williams wasn't thinking about the publicity or the attention. He was thinking about the 8-year-old girl whose future had been at stake in this case, and about all the other victims of hatred and prejudice who were counting on the justice system to protect them. The immediate consequences for Coleman were just the beginning. The real work of justice was still ahead. 3 days after the shocking courtroom assault, the security camera footage had gone viral across social media platforms. The video showed everything, from Officer Coleman's initial disrespectful testimony to the moment he slapped Judge Williams and the judge's calm, dignified response to the attack. The footage spread like wildfire, shared millions of times with comments ranging from outrage at Coleman's behavior to praise for Judge Williams' composure under such extreme circumstances. News organizations around the world picked up the story, making it an international symbol of both the persistence of racism and the strength of those who stand against it. Judge Williams watched the news coverage from his home, still amazed by how quickly the story had spread. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with interview requests from major news networks, but he had decided to let his actions speak for themselves. He had always believed that judges should stay out of the spotlight and let the legal process do its work. "Dad, you're famous," his college-age daughter said, showing him her phone with thousands of supportive comments from people around the world. "People are calling you a hero." Judge Williams smiled but shook his head. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I just did my job. The real heroes are the people who stand up to hatred and discrimination every day without any cameras watching." Meanwhile, Officer Coleman was discovering that his problems were growing worse by the hour. The police department had moved quickly to suspend him without pay and begin termination proceedings. Chief Thompson held a press conference to distance the department from Coleman's actions. Officer Coleman's behavior was completely unacceptable and goes against everything our department stands for, Chief Thompson told the gathered reporters. "We have zero tolerance for racism, hatred, or violence from our officers. He will face the full consequences of his actions, and we are cooperating fully with all investigations." The FBI had indeed opened a civil rights investigation, treating the assault as a hate crime. Federal prosecutors were reviewing the case to determine if additional federal charges should be filed beyond the state charges Coleman was already facing. Coleman's lawyer, a public defender who had been assigned to the case, was struggling to find any way to defend his client's actions. The video evidence was clear and undeniable, and there were dozens of witnesses to corroborate what had happened. "The best we can hope for is a plea deal," the lawyer told Coleman during one of their meetings. "You're looking at serious prison time, and fighting this case would only make things worse." But Coleman still couldn't accept responsibility for what he had done. Even sitting in jail, facing the loss of everything he had worked for, he continued to blame Judge Williams for the situation. "He disrespected me first," Coleman insisted. "He made me look bad in front of all those people. I was just defending myself." His lawyer shook his head in frustration. "You assaulted a judge in open court while using racial slurs. There's no defense for that, and continuing to blame the judge is only going to hurt you more." Back at the courthouse, the custody case had been resolved quickly after Coleman's arrest. Tony, the father, had agreed to supervised visitation only, admitting through his lawyer that Coleman's biased investigation had hidden the truth about his violent behavior. Lisa finally had custody of her daughter and protection from an abusive situation that could have continued if Coleman's false report had been believed. She sent a letter to Judge Williams thanking him for his courage and for ensuring that the truth came out. "Your Honor," the letter read, "I know this has been difficult for you, but I want you to know that your strength and dignity saved my daughter from a dangerous situation. Officer Coleman's lies could have put her in harm's way, but you didn't let that happen. Thank you for being brave enough to stand up to him." Judge Williams was touched by the letter, but he knew that Lisa's case was just one example of how biased policing could affect real people's lives. He decided to use the attention from this incident to address larger issues of justice and equality. 2 weeks after the assault, Judge Williams agreed to give one interview to a respected news program. He wanted to make sure his message was clear and thoughtful rather than reactive. "This incident wasn't really about me," he told the interviewer. "It was about the importance of having a justice system that treats everyone fairly, regardless of their race, background, or economic status." Officer Coleman's behavior was extreme, but the prejudice he displayed affects countless cases in ways that are less obvious but just as harmful. The interviewer asked him about how he had remained so calm during the assault. "I learned a long time ago that responding to hatred with more hatred doesn't solve anything," Judge Williams explained. "My job is to represent justice and fairness, and I couldn't do that if I let anger and emotion take over. The best response to prejudice is to show that it can't break your commitment to doing what's right." Meanwhile, Coleman's case was moving through the legal system with surprising speed. The evidence was overwhelming, and prosecutors were determined to send a clear message that attacks on the judicial system would not be tolerated. Coleman was facing multiple felony charges, including assault on a judicial officer, criminal contempt of court, and federal civil rights violations. His lawyer had managed to negotiate a plea deal that would avoid the death penalty, but Coleman was looking at a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. The plea hearing was scheduled for a month after the incident, and it would take place in the same courtroom where Coleman had committed his crimes. Judge Williams would not be presiding over that case due to his status as the victim, but he planned to attend to give a victim impact statement. Coleman's police union, which had initially tried to defend him, had withdrawn their support after seeing the video evidence. Other officers in the department had spoken out against his actions, making it clear that his views didn't represent their values. Coleman was a bad cop who let his personal prejudices interfere with his duty, said Officer Janet Rodriguez, who had worked with Coleman for several years. Most of us are relieved that he's gone. He made all of us look bad, and he put victims at risk with his biased investigations. The police department announced a comprehensive review of all cases Coleman had worked on in the past 5 years, looking for evidence of bias or misconduct that might have affected other victims. They found several cases where his report seemed incomplete or biased, leading to new investigations and reviews. As the plea hearing approached, Judge Williams reflected on how the incident had changed his perspective on his role as a judge.
He had always taken his responsibilities seriously,
But now he understood even more clearly how important it was to stand firm against all forms of injustice. Every case that comes before me involves real people whose lives can be dramatically affected by what happens in my courtroom, he told his wife one evening. I can't control what people bring into my courtroom, but I can control how I respond to it. On the day of Coleman's plea hearing, the courtroom was packed with reporters, community leaders, and supporters of Judge Williams. Coleman entered in an orange jumpsuit, his head down, looking nothing like the arrogant police officer who had strutted into that same courtroom just a month earlier. When asked how he pleaded to the charges against him, Coleman's voice was barely audible as he said, "Guilty." Judge Williams gave his victim impact statement, focusing not on personal revenge but on the broader implications of Coleman's actions. Officer Coleman's assault on this court was an attack on the principle that justice should be blind to race, religion, and background, he said. His actions reminded us that the fight for equality and fairness is far from over, but they also showed us that hatred cannot triumph over justice when good people stand together. The judge presiding over the plea hearing sentenced Coleman to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Coleman would also lose his pension, his law enforcement certification, and his right to carry firearms. As Coleman was led away in handcuffs, Judge Williams felt no satisfaction in seeing his attacker punished. Instead, he felt hope that this incident might lead to positive changes in how the justice system addresses bias and discrimination. In the months that followed, Judge Williams became an advocate for police reform and judicial independence. He spoke at law schools and community events about the importance of fighting prejudice wherever it appears in the justice system. The courtroom where the assault took place was renamed the Justice and Equality Courtroom, with a plaque commemorating not just the incident but the principle that hatred has no place in the pursuit of justice. Judge Williams continued to serve on the bench for many more years, handling thousands of cases with the same calm dignity he had shown on that shocking day. But he never forgot the lesson that even in the darkest moments, justice can prevail when people have the courage to stand up for what's right. Officer Coleman served his full sentence, and upon his release he struggled to find work and rebuild his life. The viral video of his actions followed him everywhere, a permanent reminder of how quickly a person can destroy their life and reputation through hatred and poor choices. The incident became a case study in law schools and police academies across the country.